My name is Rhonda Witty, and I am 55 years old, and I live in Toledo, Ohio. And today we're going to be talking about how I survived a relationship that actually put me in danger as well as my children, and I was engaged to marry a murderer. The first man that impacted my life would be my grandfather. He was a strong, very family oriented man, and he taught me at a young age independence, and he taught me to value myself. Growing up, I was one of 5 children. My mother was a single mom, and I can remember at an early age not really knowing who my father was. But I do remember when I realized that I didn't know who my father was when I would be introduced to the fathers of my cousins. My mother was my mother and my father. I, like many girls, many young girls, really did not have a role model to mimic. I found myself pregnant at the age of 15 and giving birth at the age of 16. And that relationship was just, it definitely wasn't a relationship. So I was a teen mom pretty early, and I was raised in a strict Christian family. Even though my mom was a single mother, she raised us in holiness, and we had a strict family upbringing. So dating was not allowed. That was something that was frowned upon or looked down upon. But just like anything else, we figure out a way in order to sneak and do the things that we want to do. And so, needless to say, I found myself pregnant at 15, and I gave birth to my first child at 16. So I really didn't have a role model, nor did I have dating experience. I think in the back of my head, I always was looking for a person or a man like my grandfather. He would always take time out, sit me on his lap, and have conversations and pay attention to me. I always wanted my son, who was my firstborn, to have a father-son relationship like I had with my grandfather. But unfortunately, history has a way of repeating itself. And just like I was a fatherless child, for many, many, many years, my son also had no exposure to his father as well. I met the future father of my children, the young lady that I babysat for. She was a few years older than me. And while babysitting for her, one day the phone rings, and I answered the phone, and the gentleman on the other line asked for her, and I said, "She's not here. I'm babysitting. Can I take a message?" And gave me his name and said, tell her, that I called. So that was my first initial interaction with him. The second time that he called, he asked, was she there? And I indicated that she wasn't. And then he, asked my name and struck up a conversation with me. He was extremely intelligent, very articulate. And one of the first questions he asked me was, who was my favorite author? And I thought that was really, really odd because, no guy I'd ever met at that point had ever even, talked about reading a book, let alone who was my favorite author. And so our relationship started initially through phone conversations. Now, one of the things that he did not share with me up front was his age. And at this time, I had my son. So I was between, I want to say maybe 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there, in that age range. When it became time for us to meet face to face, he kind of said, "Yeah, I got something I probably should tell you, or I need to tell you, but I want you to be open-minded, because I firmly believe," and I'll never forget this statement stuck with me, "that age is a chronological proof of existence." And at that time, he was almost 30. So initially upon meeting him, I was extremely impressed by his level of intelligence. I thought he was extremely handsome, and a conversation between us just flowed effortlessly. I don't think that the grooming was in order for me to be introduced into prostitution, although he did tell me that, in his earlier years, that he was a pimp. What he did for me was educate me on street life, because all I knew at this point was church. So he definitely gave me an education on how things in the world operated. He was kind of protective of me in that he didn't want me to be exposed to certain things. So he kind of educated me so that I could be aware of, if I ever ran into certain situations. I definitely think that he was introducing me to his past and his current because he knew what was going on or what would be going on in the future. So one of the things that was kind of unique about that relationship is he'd be around for a while, and then he'd disappear for a while. He'd kind of fall off the face of the earth. Later on, I would discover that he created a criminal act, or he committed a criminal act and actually got incarcerated and was in jail or in prison during the time that I didn't see him. And we would kind of resume as if nothing ever happened. And in the midst of there, I got pregnant again, and I had my second child. When I found out I was pregnant, actually, it was during one of those times that he was missing. And when he came back around, my second child, I would want to say was maybe 7 or 8 months old. And during this time, he kind of made me aware of a scheme that he was perpetuating throughout the city, and it was called theft by deception. And as the relationship progressed is when I started getting exposed to the backside. And the backside was perpetuated by drug use. And because of the use, then that's what perpetuated the criminal acts that would kind of aid in the purchasing and the continuation of his abuse. So I'm 19, 20, somewhere in there, not a whole lot of work experience, but I got employed by a local check cashing company. And I worked at one location, and I, gained knowledge, I gained experience. And in the second location, they offered me the management position. When I moved to the other location, he would come and visit periodically, and one of the things he would always say to me is that he was concerned about my safety. And I can remember him coming into the store, on more than one occasion, just to kind of see where I work and, to see the situation. And then he started saying stuff to me like, listen, don't you ever put your life in danger or in jeopardy. If anybody ever comes in and, threatens you or wants to rob this place, don't be a superhero. Don't try to do anything brave. A little time went on, and I was at work. I came out in the lobby. I'll never forget this as long as I live. Came out on the lobby. I was sweeping and cleaning the glass, and the doorbell chimed. And as soon as the doorbell chimed, my instinct said, get back behind the glass so that I could service the customer. So I go to unlock the door to get back. And then there's a gun that's placed to my back. And the guy says to me, do whatever I tell you and I won't hurt you. So instantly in my head, I can remember the conversations that we had in the past where he said to me, whatever you do, don't be a hero. He asked me to unlock the door. I did. He asked me where the money was. I showed him where the money was. He proceeded to empty the safe and the cash register. And as quickly as he came, he left. So as soon as it was over, I hit the panic button. There was a panic button under the counter, and within minutes, law enforcement was everywhere. I can remember the detective giving me his card and said, give me a call in the next day or two and come down and talk to us. So I call him, and then he said, okay, well, I will take you when you go, to meet with these detectives. Everything is going to be fine. They just want to make certain you had nothing to do with this, and you don't know anything. You had nothing to do with this, but this is customary. This is what they do. This is when I started to think something here ain't right. The day I go down to talk to the detectives, I talked to them and told them everything that happened. The establishment had cameras, so they saw everything that happened. I just explained to them. The day it was time for me to go down to the police department, I had already talked to them, and they set up a day and time for me to come back and take a lie detector test. Before it was time for me to go inside to take the lie detector test, he says to me, I'm going to give you a pill because you're so nervous and I need you to calm down. I need you to relax. So I loved him. I trusted him. He gave me this pill, and I placed it under my tongue, and it dissolved. So long story short, I go in, I take this lie detector test. I did everything that, they asked me questions. They hooked me up to all these electrodes and all of these questions. I take this lie detector test, and so then, the detective says to me, he comes back, they look at the results, they detected no deception. So I was ruled out as a suspect, told me to take his card if I ever hear anything in the future, to let them know. It was at this time that he said to me, I'm going to say something to you. I'm going to tell you something, and promise me that you won't get upset and that you won't judge me. And that is when he told me that he was behind it. There was a gun put to my back. And my life flashed before my eyes. And you're telling me that you were behind this? And he says, the gun wasn't loaded. He was working with me. He wasn't going to hurt you. I had already told you what to do, and you did it. And it was at this point that I really, really understood to a greater magnitude just how diabolical he really was. But at this point, I was so emotionally and, invested in him. So even though I knew that he did this to me, I still maintained the relationship. After this robbery, he obviously now had the resources in order to feed his addiction. And at this point, I realized that he is doing, shortly after this robbery, we took a trip to Columbus, and while we were in Columbus, he actually purchased a handgun. And all of this is important because it plays into the actual incident that happened in my car. I can remember, once he got this gun, he wanted me to learn how to fire it. I fired this gun in an open field. So my hands touched this gun. So I had to say that because it all ties into this homicide. I watched this man shoot somebody in the foot while I was standing right next to him because, the guy looked at me the wrong way. I watched him take a tool and bust out the teeth of another man who was sitting in the back seat of a car that we were in, and my children were sitting next to this man. I'm in the passenger seat, he's in the driver's seat, and this man proceeds to compliment about how beautiful I am. And the next thing I know, a tool from a tool bag is slunged into this man's teeth, and teeth crumble everywhere, blood splatter on my children. When we came back from Columbus, he dropped me off at the hospital because I actually suffered a miscarriage. So he dropped me off and never came back. So a couple of days had went by, and he still had my car. And I'm home, we're sleeping, and we get wakened by a police detective that knocks on the door, and my mom answers the door, and they ask for me. She comes, she gets me, I come down, I'm talking to this detective, and they said, ma'am, we wanted to inform you that a homicide has been committed on the interior of your car. So he says, can we sit down somewhere? We sit down, and he explains to me what happened. He says that quite naturally they ran the plate. The plate came back to me. There was a young man who was shot who died as a result of his injuries. And the father of my children was also shot. He was at that time being treated at a local hospital for a gunshot wound to the thigh. And so the detective then said that I would need to come down to the police department and give a formal statement. That incident was the beginning of the worst chapter of my entire life. He was treated and released from the hospital because they treated it as self-defense initially. And so then this detective begins to say to me, we have been watching him for quite some time. He's linked to several theft by deceptions for local businesses. And there is a woman that's tied to these deceptions, because we have recordings of a woman who is kind of working with him that was placing the calls as well as him. And he says to me and to my mother, you've got to tell us everything that you know, because if you don't tell us everything that you know, you're going to be implicated in these theft by deceptions. And do you know how much time you could be looking at and yada, yada, yada? So I began to tell them everything that I knew. And in the telling them of everything that I knew, the gun came up. And because they said, do you know if he owned a gun? Yes, he did own a gun. We went to this specific place in Columbus. He purchased this gun. His story was he went to purchase from a dealer who got in the car. And when the dealer got in the car, he brandished a gun and attempted to rob him of his money. So I then put the gun in his hand. So then the investigation shifted from self-defense to, maybe this ain't self-defense after all, because now I put a gun in his hand. I didn't realize that by putting a gun in his hand, it then shifted the investigation from them taking it from self-defense to investigating him for homicide. He gets out of the hospital, and he said, "Did they say anything else?" I didn't tell him I had talked to these detectives or anything. My mother said, "Just don't say anything." And then he was informed that this involuntary manslaughter, or this self-defense, was now being investigated as a manslaughter. I said to him, "Well, what happened?" And then he said, "Well, this cat, he got in my car, and you know me, sometimes I can get a little greedy. And so instead of, just paying him I went to snatch his bag. I snatched his bag. And when I snatched his bag, I had the gun pointed at him, and he grabbed it, and we wrestled for it. And in the midst of him grabbing it and wrestling for it, he was shot, and I was too. So then, because of me and because of my testimony, I was able to, the defense, or the prosecutor actually, was able to bring charges against him. And I was the single primary evidence that they had that ended up convicting him. He was in jail, I want to say, for maybe 12 or 13 months. They let him go free for about 4 months until they built up this case against him. It took them about 4 months. And then once they had enough evidence, they found the pawn shop where the gun was purchased. They were building up all this evidence. And then 4 months later, they end up arresting him and charging him with murder. And then, like I said, he didn't know I talked to them because my mom warned me not to tell him. But he's locked up. He's incarcerated at this point. He's downtown, and they're building up this case against him. So he's calling me collect every day, and like, I have no clue what these people have against me. There's no way that they can hold me. They don't know anything about, whatever went on, yada, yada, yada. So these charges are going to be dropped. He was convinced these charges were going to be dropped. A few weeks after him being in there, I started to get morning sickness. And I discovered that I'm now pregnant again. And during the time that he was on trial for this murder, and I knew that I was the number one evidence that the prosecution had against him, and he had no clue. This went on for months on end. I was a wreck because it was almost like I was living two lives. In the discovery, his attorney applied for a discovery, and in this discovery, my name was given as a witness. So the day before the discovery was given, I told him, because he said, "I'll know tomorrow everything they have against me." So I told him, I might as well tell you now. I talked to the detective, and I told him everything I knew. And he said, "Then don't say another word. Come see me tomorrow." So, of course, phones are tapped. So I couldn't tell when I go and I see him. And he said, I told him everything. Tell me everything that you told him, and I did. And so he said, "You got to go in hiding." And I did. I went in hiding. And there was a warrant issued for my arrest because I failed to appear. I was summoned as the witness. And so I tried to carry this on as long as possible. He kept telling me that if they don't have a witness, the case is going to be dropped. So I'm thinking, I went into hiding, and I stayed with some girl he knew, me and my children. But it dragged on, and it dragged on, and it dragged on. And I finally said, I can't just keep on hiding with my kids. We got to figure this out. I want to say that I was in hiding for about 6 months. And the prosecution was determined to come against him. And they were looking for me. They were searching for me everywhere. So finally, I talked to my mother. My mother said, "Listen, I don't know. You've lost your mind. You're about to go to jail. You're about to lose your kids. You need to, figure this out." So I ended up turning myself into his attorney, and then, turning myself into the court. I ended up testifying against him. So imagine sitting on a court stand, testifying against the man that you love, the father of your children. And because of my testimony, he ended up getting convicted of involuntary manslaughter in the commission of a felony. Again, he wanted to still control the narrative as far as I was concerned, and he wanted to tie me down to the point where I would be there once he got out. So he told me, I want to marry you. One visit I was there, I would like to marry you. Come on X day, and the chaplain is here, and we'll get married. And I was extremely excited. I love this man. I thought for sure he was, my person. So I went down to the jail to marry him, and that day the chaplain did not show up. And I had a very good friend of mine that I was confiding in, a big brother, so to speak. And I told him I was going to marry him. He told me he thought I was making a big mistake, but I went, and the chaplain didn't show up. And so I did not marry him. But that friend that I ended up talking to is my now husband, who is a pastor. We have been married for, it'll be 32 years in February. I married my husband while the father of my children was in prison. My husband knew the history because he was my friend. I confided in him. And he even knew that my heart was still with the father of my children. And he said to me, "You're a good girl. If you give me a chance and if you marry me, it'll be the best decision that you ever made." And when I tell you, God saved me from myself in the form of my husband, because had he not came into my life, I probably would have went back yet again on a different day and married a murderer. He is an amazing man. And the crust of this story is my husband's name is Robert.